Tonight on Reporting Scotland, the number of people waiting more than 4 hours in A&E reached record levels over the festive period. Do missed waiting time targets have a wider significance?
Actually, it really is a measure of the whole system, and the emergency department is almost like the pressure valve, which shows strains in other areas.
Also in the programme, the petrochemical giant Ineos launches a legal challenge to the Scottish Government's decision to ban fracking. Bus passengers in the Glasgow area are facing a sharp rise in many prices. Is this the new holder of the title of the country's most dangerous road? And the chair of women's football in Scotland says a professional league here could be a reality within the next 3 years. Good evening. The number of people facing lengthy delays in Scotland's accident and emergency units hit a record high between Christmas and New Year. 78% of patients across Scotland were seen and then treated or discharged within the target time of 4 hours, well below the 95% target. The Health Secretary, Shona Robertson, has again apologised to patients, blaming exceptional winter pressures. Here's our health and social care correspondent, Shelley Joffrey.
Alan Brown ended up in A&E in Livingston on Boxing Day after slipping on the ice. Faced with an 8-hour wait, he hobbled home and went back when the pain became unbearable.
This time I was told a week later that it would be a 4-hour wait. And I thought, well, that's fine. 4 hours, I can wait 4 hours. I've been waiting a week. And after about 3.5 hours, I was eventually seen. I had an x-ray done, and I spoke to a nurse. And she told me that I'd fractured my ankle. I shouldn't have been walking around on it for a week.
Borders General Hospital has felt the strain like hospitals across the country. More than 100 patients here waited longer than 4 hours over the festive period. Staff at every level have been working flat out.
I've been amazed when I've come into work at 8 o'clock in the morning and I've seen 4 medical consultants who would not be expected to be in an emergency department at all in the department before me, seeing patients that have waited for a bed overnight to make sure that they're happy that the correct treatments are being initiated.
Bottlenecks at A&E are often caused by problems they have no control over. There are currently 50 patients medically fit to leave who are stranded at this hospital, and that's 50 beds that could be used to ease the pressure on A&E.
It's very much a problem with the whole system as opposed to a problem exclusively with the front door of the hospital. We have increasing challenges across social care and across healthcare, discharging people from the hospital.
I call on Shona Robertson.
Under pressure politically, the Health Secretary gave a statement to Parliament saying demand on the NHS has been unprecedented.
Well, because of the impact of flu, of coming on the back of the icy weather, we had lots of frail elderly people still in hospital recovering from hip fractures, and those, of course, those elderly people taking up beds, understandably. So usually there is a bit of capacity between Christmas and New Year. This year there really wasn't. There was beds were hard to come by, and of course that puts additional pressure on the system.
Scotland's A&E performance has been healthier than the rest of the UK, but it's been in decline since mid-November. The government will now be hoping for a speedy recovery. Shelley Joffrey reporting Scotland, Melrose.
The petrochemical giant Ineos has launched a legal challenge to the Scottish Government's decision to ban fracking. The company already imports shale gas by ship from the United States, but it wanted to begin fracking locally to provide gas for its site at Grangemouth. Well, our environment correspondent Kevin Keane is there. Kevin, so why a legal challenge?
Well, essentially, Jackie, it's because they believe that the decision of the minister taken last year was illegal. That decision was for what was described as an effective ban on fracking. That meant no new legislation banning it per se, but that local authorities would receive a letter telling them to effectively use planning powers to deny permission for any kind of infrastructure related to planning to be built. And that was how a moratorium lasting 2 years was also carried out. Now, the problem that the Scottish Scottish Government has is that fracking is essentially a reserved matter. The licences are issued by the UK Government, so they were restricted and limited on what powers they could use to ban this. Nevertheless, they took 2 years to come to this conclusion, presumably because they anticipated a legal challenge and they wanted to make sure that their decision was watertight. Nevertheless, INEOS believes that that decision was an illegal one.
A report that has been commissioned using the taxpayers' money to look at the science, then moves on to actually saying that it can be done safely against the regulatory backdrop, to then a decision that doesn't rest on that science, doesn't rest on the academic opinion of those Scottish institutes that were asked to do that piece of work. That, has consequences for the money that we've invested, and it has consequences more widely for businesses and their confidence in investing, and that's why we've taken this decision to raise the judicial review.
And Kevin, what's been the response?
Well, the Scottish Government seems to be pretty confident in its decision. They say that that decision was reached after a careful and considered approach. They commissioned 6 reports beforehand before reaching this conclusion. The Conservatives, they're very much in favour of fracking. They say it's no surprise that there's this judicial review that's now been started. Friends of the Earth Scotland, they say that it smacks of desperation at a time when they believe that there's overwhelming public support for this ban.
Kevin Keane, thank you. Bus passengers in the Glasgow area are facing sharp fare rises. The city's biggest bus operator, First Glasgow, is increasing the price of single adult tickets by 15%. The company says that overall its prices offer value for money, but campaigners say the bus network needs a radical shake-up. Here's our transport correspondent, David Henderson.
They're a public transport lifeline, but for many passengers in the west of Scotland, bus fares are set to rise as First Glasgow hikes its prices for children and adults who buy single tickets.
If we're ever going from Bridgeton to town, it is cheaper to either get the train or literally jump in a taxi, and that's quite sad.
It is expensive, it goes up and up and up, and then the fact that they took the returns away is just even worse.
I started using the train now because the bus is too expensive.
First Glasgow insists that overall its prices offer value for money and says fares for tickets bought online have been frozen. But it's prompted fresh calls for a radical change to the way Scotland's buses work.
The number of people travelling by bus has fallen. Across the west of Scotland, the number of passenger journeys is down by 49 million in just 10 years.
At the same time, we've seen less choice for many passengers, with a decline in the number of routes and bus operators.
Buses are competing with trains, trains are competing with the subway, and we want to be encouraging more and more people to use public transport, to leave their cars at home, to improve our air quality and to reduce our carbon emissions. And these fare hikes are doing the complete opposite. It's a disaster.
The sector needs to be better regulated. At the moment, Glasgow City Council, with the best will in the world, wouldn't have any way of making sure that First Buses keeps its fares low. So we need proper regulation of the sector so that it can do that.
The Scottish Government insists these latest fare rises are the lowest in the UK, but says it's looking at options for shaking up the bus network to improve the service for passengers. David Henderson, reporting Scotland, Glasgow.
The Scottish Labour leader says it may be necessary to raise the basic rate of income tax here to close the gap in public spending. Richard Leonard told BBC Scotland he wanted to raise 3 times as much as the SNP from extra income tax. He was speaking to our political editor, Ryan Taylor.
Scottish ministers plan to levy an extra £160 million in income tax, mainly from higher earners, with tax cuts for the lowest paid. Richard Leonard says that's tinkering at the edges. He says public spending needs an extra £500 million. He'd fund that partly through a new 50p top rate, but accepts that level of higher spending would oblige everyone to pay more, including those currently on the basic 20p income tax rate.
We need to look at the basic rate of income tax. We've also suggested...
You could push up the basic rate. You're still in favour of that?
Well, our plans will be revealed in due course, Brian, but I think most people understand that if we're going close the size of deficit which exists between what's needed to provide local services and what's there in the budget and provided for in Derek Mackay's draft budget, I think people will recognise that there may be a need to look at taxation, not just at the very high end, but for kind of middle income earners as well. I've also suggested that we
basic rate wouldn't hit middle income earners, it would hit the lowest income earners as well. Those who are on the first rung of taxation.
Well, it would hit all those paying income tax, wouldn't it?
Mr Leonard defended his party's stance on Brexit, insisting Labour was working to protect jobs. He forecast that the Brexit deal would be voted down by the Commons.
And if that deal is voted down, I think that will precipitate a constitutional crisis which will pave the way for a general election. And I think the terms of the general election will be fought out on Brexit.
But what would be the point of determining Brexit via a general election when Labour's position is to leave the European Union, to leave the single market, in other words, identical to the position adopted by the Conservatives?
No, it's not identical at all. The Labour Party wants to retain access to the single market.
So do the Tories.
The Labour
so do the Tories.
Well, here's another example then. Before Christmas, Theresa May was challenged about whether she would transpose into the UK the Working Time Directive, and she refused.
Finally, Richard Leonard insisted Labour would surmount its internal problems in Scotland and offer a credible alternative to the voters. Brian Taylor, reporting Scotland.
A man has told the court he was sold by someone he worked for. He said when he ran away he was caught and beaten and told he could only leave if he paid a few grand. At the High Court in Glasgow, 2 men are accused of modern slavery and human trafficking. Our Home Affairs correspondent Rival Alderson reports.
James Keith, who's 41, said when he was 16 he was homeless and living on the streets in Glasgow. He began working for a man called Robert McPhee. They were monoblocking and tarmacking driveways. And Mr. Keith said he lived in caravans and in the front of trucks without any cooking or sanitary facilities. Mr. McPhee is a member of a travellers family, and Mr. Keith moved with them to a number of sites, including this one now abandoned near Bathgate. While here, he began working for Mr. McPhee's son James, who said he'd bought him from his father. Because of that, he couldn't leave. The prosecutor asked Mr. Keith, when you discussed with James McPhee that he apparently owned you, was there a suggestion how you could not work for him? Mr. Keith replied, give him money, it would be a good few grand. On a number of occasions, Mr. Keith told the jury he ran away, but each time he said James McPhee captured him, in his words, and returned him to work. These occasions included in Paisley and in London, where he'd been living for 2 years. Robert McPhee, his sons James and Stephen, and John Miller all deny a total of 30 charges, including modern slavery and human trafficking. The trial's expected to last 4 weeks. Rival Alderson reporting Scotland at the High Court in Glasgow.
Detectives investigating a hit and run which killed a pensioner are still trying to trace 4 witnesses. John Oxton was run over by a vehicle in Dundee's Hilltown area late on New Year's Day. Police have released CCTV images of the men who went to help him. They believe they're foreign and may have vital information which could identify the driver. It's almost 18 minutes to 7. A reminder now of tonight's top story. The number of people facing delays in Scotland's A&D units hit a record high between Christmas and New Year, with just 78% of patients being seen within 4 hours. And still to come, is this the new holder of the title Scotland's Most Dangerous Road? The Scottish Conservatives' Constitution spokesman has strongly criticised his own party for not yet bringing forward amendments to the EU withdrawal bill to make it acceptable to Holyrood. That's despite promises the changes would come at the next stage of the parliamentary process, which is next week.
I am deeply frustrated and disappointed that the United Kingdom government has not yet brought forward the amendments that it knows it needs to make, particularly, but not only, to Clause 11 of the withdrawal bill, in order to obtain this Parliament's consent. It is imperative that that legislation is passed by Westminster in order to secure a smooth Brexit.
Well, let's get reaction to that from our political correspondent, Nick Ardley. Nick, how significant is this criticism of the Westminster government from its own side?
It is significant because I think a number of Scottish Tories
are angry about this. I understand that until today, Scottish Tory MPs were still expecting those changes to happen next week. They're meeting tonight to discuss their response, but disappointed and frustrated are words I've heard a lot from them tonight. David Mundell, the Scottish Secretary, had promised those changes at the report stage, which will be next Tuesday and Wednesday in the Commons. UK government sources say that it's not been possible to agree the changes with the Scottish Government. They don't want to bring forward amendments yet until they have that backing. It doesn't mean changes won't happen. It means they'll happen in the Lords instead of the Commons, but that's what's led to much of the anger. The SNP say that this is an issue for MPs to scrutinise, not peers. Labour aren't impressed either. Ultimately, I think the Scottish Tory MPs think that if these changes eventually happen, all will be well, but they're less than impressed with the fact that it's not happening next week as they were promised.
And meanwhile, Nick, an SNP-led initiative got underway at Westminster today, but with a notable absentee.
Brexit was the issue that dominated last year, Jackie. It's the issue that will dominate again this year. Today, it was about the end game. Life gets back to normal pretty quickly after the festive period. In politics, any seasonal goodwill was never going to last long. Theresa May back in Parliament today as she continued her reshuffle.
Second day back in Parliament.
And opposition parties meeting to try and change the government's course on Brexit. The SNP, Lib Dems, Greens and Plaid Cymru all want to stay in the single market. They're forming a group to fight for it. Not everyone's on board. An empty chair for Jeremy Corbyn, who thought the meeting was a stunt, but the others think it's crucial.
Nobody voted in the referendum to become poorer, and that's the real threat that we face if we come out of the single market and the customs union. There is no viable alternative to staying in the single market and the customs union, and this is a campaign that we need to make sure that we win inside Parliament and throughout the country over the course of the coming months.
And I think what's positive about today is that we have four parties working together on a common agenda. I mean, I would like to see the Labour people here and independent-minded Conservatives.
The problem for these parties, though, is numbers. They make up less than 10% of the House of Commons, so they'll be looking for support elsewhere, business groups and unions, but also Labour politicians who are sympathetic to staying in the single market. They will include the London Mayor, Sadiq Khan, and Wales's First Minister, Carwyn Jones. The front bench, though, aren't convinced.
This is simply an oversimplification yet again by the SNP of what is a very, very complex situation. The assumption that we can keep the current single market deal is fundamentally flawed.
Instead, her party says it's focused on retaining the benefits of the current arrangements. Theresa May's slightly reshuffled cabinet met for the first time this morning. It remains committed to leaving both the single market and the customs union.
Well, first and foremost, the people of the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union, and it's quite clear that if you're to leave those institutions, that means leaving the single market and leaving the customs union, as the Prime Minister has articulated in her Lancaster House speech.
It's not a done deal! But as with last year, 2018 sees the direction of Brexit, the end game, still being hotly contested. Nick Eardley reporting Scotland, Westminster.
Now, it's accepted that short days and the lack of daylight can affect our mood and in some cases can develop into seasonal affective disorder, or SAD for short, which is sometimes known as winter depression. Well, now scientists in Glasgow believe women are more likely to be susceptible to it than men. Our reporter Graham Stewart has been finding out some more.
Remember the summer? Wouldn't it be great if this is what Scotland was like all year round?
Unfortunately, this is the sad reality. It's dull, it's dreich, and it's bitterly cold.
And it's those conditions that appear to deprive our brains of serotonin, a chemical that's thought to regulate mood and appetite. And now a Glasgow University study suggests women are more likely to feel tired and depressed at this time of year.
One thing that intrigues us is the possibility that there might be a biological mechanism that makes women more vulnerable to fluctuations in mood in response to things like day length or temperature. For example, in terms of circadian function of rest activity cycles, and whether or not there's a genetic basis to being more vulnerable to changes in day length that trigger mood changes and therefore go on to make women more vulnerable to depression than men.
It's hard to describe, but it almost feels like there's a part of my brain that's shut down. That means I just don't get as much done, and I really sort of struggle, and I just really look forward to the days getting longer. And
just the way women are. They bother more about everything than men. Men have got the easy life because they've got the women.
Oh, everything affects women. We're the ones with the hormones.
Whether it's down to lifestyle or genetics, we'll leave you with some more sunny pictures in the sure knowledge that it might be a while until we see scenes like these again. Graham Stewart, reporting Scotland.
We'll have the weather later, that'll cheer you all up. And this won't either. What is Scotland's most dangerous road? Well, for years, the A9 to Inverness held that unenviable title. It's now being upgraded. But now, new figures obtained by BBC Scotland suggest there were more accidents on the A82 from Glasgow to Inverness. Campaigners say this adds weight to their argument that more development there is needed. Ian McInnes reports.
The upgrading of the A9 is continuing apace, with the latest section between Kincraig and Dalradi opening late last year. The project is due to be completed in 2025, at a final cost of around £3 billion. But new figures obtained by BBC Scotland show that there were more accidents on the A82, the main route on the west coast, over the last 6 years than on the A9.
Obviously the figures are actually not going to come as much of a surprise to the people that commute the A82 every day. What we're really looking for at the moment is just moving things forward faster than they're actually been planned to be at the moment. But what we don't want is it all done in piecemeal. As you know, there's approximately £3 billion being spent on the A9, whereas we have to celebrate the fact that it was £1 million just spent recently on the A82. So it's a little bit like getting the crumbs off the rich man's table.
While the figures show more serious and slight accidents on the A82, they do show that more fatalities occurred on the A9 during the 6-year period, with 30 people losing their lives on the A9 in comparison with 27 on the A82. However, Transport Scotland point out the two roads have very different characteristics and say it would be wrong to suggest investment on the A9 comes at the detriment of any other route. The local councillor says the gap in funding must be addressed.
I would call on Transport Scotland to actually admit that there's a problem with the A82, admit that it's been underfunded and chronically underfunded for many decades now, and start to address that underfunding.
The figures released today also show a significant rise in the volume of traffic on the West Coast route, something which is likely to intensify calls for further investment in the A82. Ian McInnes, reporting Scotland in Fort William.
The chair of UK Sport, Dame Catherine Granger, says it's realistic to expect British athletes to bring back their biggest ever Winter Olympic medal haul. Scotland's speed skating world champion Elise Christie is one of the leading podium prospects at next month's Games in South Korea. The British team aims to bring home up to 10 medals from Pyongyang.
It's still a Games that's developing very much in Great Britain. We've had some really impressive results over the past few Olympic Games and Paralympic Games, but we're seeing more consistency now, and it's definitely an area we can grow. So I think the ambition is huge, but I think it's realistic.
Well, meanwhile, a professional women's football league within the next 3 years is not out of the question. Well, that's the view of the Games chair, Vivienne McLaren. BBC Scotland has also discovered the number of women and girls playing football here has more than quadrupled over the past 6 years. Jane Lewis can tell us more.
A kickabout with a difference, and the launch of the Scottish Women's Premier League season, which gets underway next month. Those involved say they've seen the women's game go from strength to strength, but they're not done there, with bold ambitions from those at the top.
My personal goal would be that, in 3 years' time, the SWPL in Scotland is at least semi-professional, if not professional, and that we are allowing players, if they want to have a full-time job playing football in Scotland, to play in Scotland in the club. So that is our kind of dream, and I don't think it's out of the question to get to that position.
By help, read financing. Early sums suggest each club would need a minimum of around £300,000 or £400,000 a year to run either fully professional or semi-professional. Whether it's the women's national side or the domestic game, women's football has grown significantly in Scotland over the years. In 2011, there were 2,270 registered players in girls' or women's football. 6 years on, and that number is more than fourfold, with 11,537 now playing football.
I think that's down to role models, having girls play for their national team, having girls make a living out of football. We've got girls down south, we've got girls abroad who are now making a living out of football. So I think having those role models is fantastic for younger girls.
There is an interest now, it is a marketable product that we are producing now. I think especially when you see on social media comments are more focused on the game, technical, tactical, and I think that shows that we've come a long way.
So plenty to cheer about so far, a continued growth and hopes of a professional era to come. Jane Lewis, reporting Scotland.
To the weather now, and Christopher is here.
Thank you very much, Jackie. Hello there. Pretty cloudy for many of us today, but not all. Lovely blue skies from one of our weather watchers. But most of us having fairly leaden skies and staying cloudy through the course of this evening and overnight, and some rain on the way actually. Here it is on the pressure chart there. You can see this cold front out towards Ireland, heading its way towards western parts of the country by the end of the night. Ahead of it though, largely cloudy, largely dry. A few spots of drizzle in the northeast, and then the rain edging in towards the Highlands and Islands and further south by the end of the night. Ahead of it, some clear conditions, so temperatures down close to freezing, if not lower. Elsewhere, low single digits. What it means is tomorrow gets off to a cloudy, damp start with that rain edging its way north and eastwards. Not much weight to it really, but cloudy and damp fare nonetheless. There will be an improving story across parts of the west and southwest as it dries up and the cloud slowly thins and breaks, but exactly how quickly that happens is open to doubt. Once the sun comes out though, 6 or 7 Celsius is possible. Not bad at all. Further east, cloudier and cooler, but still 5 or 6 degrees is warmer than we've seen of late. Across the northeast, cloudy and damp with this rain sort of coming to a halt across parts of Grampian in towards the far north and the Northern Isles, and still breezy across Orkney and Shetland from the southeast, but not as windy as we've seen today. Then tomorrow night, that rain edging up towards the far north and lingering across Orkney and Shetland. Behind it, drying up and clearing up, there will be some clear skies and it will be a chilly night as this ridge of high pressure builds in. What that means though for Thursday is it's a bright and a sunny day, a return to crisp conditions that many of us saw yesterday. Still though, a legacy of cloud and wet weather across the far north and northeast, and there could well be some stubborn areas of mist and fog for the central belt and the south. Friday, quite a breezy day. You can see the tightly packed isobars there, but largely dry, although rain waiting in the wings coming our way later. That's the forecast for now.
Thank you, Christopher. And that's Reporting Scotland. Join us later for our update just after the 10 o'clock news. Until then, from all the team, have a good evening. Bye-bye.